and I'm going to be talking about musical contests at athletic games. This is something which I've always found very curious and always wanted to understand better. So when Paul said we're going to have a special session on games, I thought, right, I'll talk about musical contests at games. And I looked into it and it's quite strange what I found. So I'd like to start, first of all, by just drawing your attention to this Skiffos, which is in California, in Berkeley. And I'd like to ask you what you can see here on this Skiffos. Anyone wanted to point out anything that they noticed on this part? Yes, sir.
The guy on the right got alive.
Good. Excellent. Guy on the right got a lie. How old is the guy on the right?
He looked
Youngish, right? What about the guy on the left? Older. Okay. Can anyone tell me what the guy on the left is holding? Was that his hand there? Anyone got any idea what the guy on the left is holding? What if I show you this? Who said ah? Who was that? Someone had an idea. What is that there? Anyone know? Yes, I can't hear that, who that is, but that's a wise person who just called out. That is a spiritual, and here you have the famous boss of the athlete scraping himself down. You anoint yourself with oil, then you scrape yourself down. So, we go back to this picture of this joke. What we have here is we have a boy with a lyre and an older man with a strigil. What's going on? What's going on? Any ideas what's going on here? It's a bit of a puzzle, and I would say that scholars are not really agreed, but in order to interpret it properly, we do have to look at the other side of the lyre. Now here we have the same two figures. Sorry, the other side of the scale, of the little cup. Here we have the same two figures, it seems, from their kind of facial compositions. Once again, the old man is giving the young man a skiffos, but this time, the young man is naked. He seems to be holding some kind of cloak. And here we have this column, this little pillar, which suggests some kind of athletic games, some kind of sporting race of some kind. Anyone want to try to put these two images together into some kind of coherent? Here we are.
The spiritual whatever is it's like an award that's given, like some sort of awards or something that athletes use to clean themselves up after competing.
Yes. So that would make sense for the second image, right?
Yeah.
So he's done his exercise. He's naked. Maybe he's about to put his cloak back on, but the old man says, "Well, have a spiritual and clean yourself first." Seems like a good idea. But how does that explain the first one? Why is he being given a spiritual in the first one?
Because poets and other people with musical talents compete in athletic games as well.
Well, this is you on to my point here. There is, it seems, a spiritual offered to the young man after he's been playing music. He seems to have come from somewhere he's playing music, he's offered a spiritual, and then a spiritual offered on the other side. Now, there's different ways of interpreting this. Some people think that this older man is a lover, and he's offering him a gift and encouraging him. This is very often the symbol of the older lovers and the younger man. He gives him a gift, which is associated with athletic beauty. The young man is a cultured young man with a lyre. That's one explanation. Another explanation is you also look particularly at this stick, which is often in vases, a symbol of a trainer. Right? So if we can imagine this is his trainer rather than his lover, then we might see that this stroke shows on two sides the two most important aspects of Greek education. We have, on the one hand, we have the musical education of the trainer, who's then giving him a spiritual to encourage him to move onto the other side of his education, which is athletics. Now I'm going to come back to these images and ask you to consider them again at the end. But I think it's interesting to consider how these two images of different kinds of education or of different kinds of useful activity might interrelate. Right. Now, I wasn't here for Francesca's talk, but I'm sure she has explained how Pindar manages to elevate the athletes and to praise them. Now, this isn't true of all Greek poets. Not all Greek poets are equally keen on athletics. So here I have Xenophanes of Colon, an early 6th century philosopher and poet. And here he's making a little bit of a complaint. But if someone were to gain a victory by the swiftness of his feet, or in the pentathlon, he would have greater renown than others in the eyes of the townsmen, and he would gain a conspicuous front seat at the games, and he would have food from the public store granted by the city. Or if he were to gain a victory even with his horses, he would obtain all these things, although he is not as deserving as I. For my expertise, like Sophia, is better than the strength of man or horses. He complains, he explains why he says it's not rational, it's not right to give strength precedence over good expertise, because boxers and athletes don't achieve by their victories better law and order in the city. Little would be the city's joy if one were to win while contending by the banks of Pisa, but this does not fatten the city's treasury. The point is that athletes do no good, and Xenophanes' claim is that poets might do better, or at least wise men might do better. Now we see this same complaint adapted in a different way in Euripides' Ortilochus, which unfortunately is just a fragmentary play, and it's really unclear who this, where the speech fits into the narrative. But Ortilochus, who's a sort of thief and a trickster, seems probably him who's making this complaint about athletes. He says, of countless bad things existing throughout Greece, none is worse than athletes of the Greek. For they neither learn well how to manage a household. Moreover, they cannot manage property or cope with misfortune because they have not learned good habits, and change with difficulties is hard on them. They are splendid in their prime, but when old age and its harshness falls upon them, they fall away like cloaks that have lost their threads. And I blame too, I criticise, he says, the Greeks' custom of gathering because of these men to value useless pleasures for the sake of a feast. He hates these feasts for athletes. He thinks they're utterly pointless. Because what's the point? Because a man who's wrestled well, what man who's wrestled well has defended his ancestral city? Nothing about winning the wreaths is good for the city. He says instead, wreathing with leaves should be for men who are wise, sophos again, and brave. And for the man who leads the city best through being prudent and just, and whose words deliver it from evil acts by removing feuds and factions. Such things are good for every city and for all Greeks. Okay, so we have these kind of complaints from Euripides writing at the end of the 5th century, Xenophanes writing beginning of the 6th. These are different times and different places, but there's a kind of feeling that athletes are actually a kind of drag on society. Now, that athletes drag on society, and that there is that their prizes are misplaced, and they should instead go to the wise, and wisdom very much associated with poetry. But it's not actually entirely true that it's only athletics, it's only broad, it's only those competing in the physical exercise, in feats of physical exercise that we're invited. In fact, and I don't know if Francesca mentioned this, we have one Pindar ode which is dedicated to a victor in a flute competition. Right? I beseech you, this is one of Pindar's poems. He's singing, he addresses Akragas, the hometown of Midas, and he says, receive this crown from Pytho, offered by famous Midas, and welcome man himself, who defeated Hellas, as in all the competition of Hellas, in the art which Pallas Athena once invented by weaving into music the fierce Gorgon's deathly dirge. Right? So his victory was not in horse racing, or chariot racing, or foot racing, or boxing, or pentathlon, or any of these things, but in playing the flute, the aulos. Now, the poem is quite a short one. He goes on to explain the history of the aulos music, according to this poem, which is that Perseus, when he kills Medusa, the Gorgon, the other two Gorgons, her sisters, lament. And then, when Athena rescues Perseus from these toils, the maiden composed a melody with every sound from pipes, so that she might imitate with instruments the echoing wail that was forced from the gnashing jaws of Euryalus. The goddess invented it, but invented it for mortals to have, and she called it the tune of many heads, famous reminder of contests where people flock. Right, so we have this flute music, which is meant to kind of imitate the sound of the Gorgons. I mean, they call it a deathly dirge, right? So this is a kind of quite grim kind of music, maybe quite moody, quite dark, I suggest. Now, it's not just, however, that we have this particular part of the game which is dedicated to music. In fact, we have quite good evidence from vase painting that flute playing is associated with all kinds of exercise. So first of all, we have these two scenes. I mean, there are many, many more of these. I think the one program has 53 scenes of flute players with athletics all at the same time. Here you have people performing various athletic tasks. And there you see the flute player right at the top there. And here again, you have the jumpers jumping with weights and the flute player there. Now, what's quite interesting about both of these is you see the man with the staff. Do you remember what the staff suggested in the vase before? What was it? Exactly. So here, we have trainers with staffs. So this suggests that the flute playing is not exclusive to the festival, but actually is the accompaniment of athletics in general. Right? In the kind of in the palestra, in the exercise yard, you've also got flutists playing along, which is curious to me. Then we have, athletes, flute players, as accompaniment to actual competition. So the reason why I say that is because here you have the flute player at the top and you have various sports being performed. But here you have someone, a young man, a boy probably, being offered a crown. You can see that someone being offered a crown. That would only happen in the competition itself. So in this competition, you've got the flute players as well. So why are we having flute players to go along with athletes? Why would we play flutes while people are performing athletic feats? We have various explanations offered by some admittedly very late sources. Sometimes we classicists, we haven't got the sources that we want. And so for a lot of this kind of thing, we have to rely on quite late Roman sources writing about customs which may have changed by the time they are writing. But still, they're the best evidence we have. But I'm not sure about this little quote from Philostratus. For the rules regard jumping as one of the more difficult exercises and allow the jumper to be spurred on by the flute, and they give him wings by means of the jumping weight. It seems a little strange that the fluting might be given to the jumper so to make him jump higher. That is the explanation offered by Philostratus. Pausanias offers a slightly different explanation. He suggests that it's for this reason the Pythian flute song is played while the competitors in the pentathlon are jumping. The flute song is sacred to Apollo and Apollo won Olympic victories. So this idea that the flute is generally associated with Apollo, which we'll talk about in a moment, and that's why they play it when you're doing the pentathlon. It's a bit vague because it seems like why the pentathlon exactly. And then finally, there's another bit of Pausanias where we're told a bit more about this flute playing and accompaniment to the pentathlon. At the next 6 Pythian festivals, Pythiocrates was victor, being the only flute player so to distinguish himself. It's also clear that at the Olympic festival he fluted 6 times for the pentathlon. So we know that at the Olympic festival, not just the Pythian Games, but also the Olympian Games, people had flutes alongside the pentathlon. But here we return again to our Pindar club, because Pythiocrates has actually won a competition himself. He won 6 times at the Pythian Games. So there seems to be flute playing which accompanies athletes both in the exercise yard and at the athletic festivals, and then there's flute playing which is itself a competition. Now, we have these very late sources describing this practice, but we also have some very early sources. In fact, the earliest source we have for a kind of musical competition, I'll explain what I mean by musical in a sec, musical competition at athletic games is here in Hesiod, who's perhaps a little later than Homer, but not much, as we'll see. Right, so this is what he says. This is a poem, The Works of Days, in which he's mainly giving advice to his brother and talking about sailing being not a very good idea. He's only sailed once. And he says that he went to, when he sailed to Euboea, which is a tiny little island off the coast of mainland Greece. Large island across the Tyrrhenian Channel. He doesn't sail much, Hesiod. But he went to the games for wise Amphinomus, crossing over to Chalcis, and the sons of that great-hearted man had announced many contests and set out prizes. And now I declare I gained the victory with my song and carried off an ear tripod which I dedicated to the muses of Helicon. So here Hesiod, in his persona as of the works and days, he seems to represent an episode in which he travelled to a contest somewhere else to participate in games set out for the funeral of Amphinomus, set out by his sons. Now, we're told that the sons of the great-hearted man announced many contests and set out prizes. And he gained the victory with my song. Now, there's nothing there to actually declare that there were necessarily athletic games here. We know from funeral games in general that, we know that from the Iliad and from elsewhere, that funeral games seem to generally include athletics. But there's enough there to say there were many contests with many prizes, and he gained victory with his song, suggests that his song, that wasn't the only competition, there were other competitions available with other prizes. That's certainly the way that it's interpreted in later classical times. So these few lines obviously attracted quite a lot of attention for the classical Greeks and later Greeks. And they began to consider what was this contest that Hesiod had won. Now, inevitably, people would like to speculate that the contest that Hesiod won was against another poet that we all know. Who are we going to set Hesiod against? We're going to set him against Homer. Now, this contest, this is a text which really is a 1st century AD text, very late text, but we think it's based on Alcinous's 4th century Museion. We think that might be based on an even older text, a 5th century text, right? 5th century BC text from classical Athens. And so this text records a meeting between Homer and Hesiod. Now, we're not necessarily meant to believe this, but it's worth considering that this is how the 5th century reconstructed the games of Amphinomus. This is what seemed to them to be plausible. And that might reflect quite a lot on what games were like in the 5th century. So this is talking about Homer and Hesiod. Some, however, say they flourished at the same time. So it was actually to compete with each other after meeting up at Aulis in Boeotia. Around the same time, Genictor was organising the funeral of his father Amphinomus, the king of Euboea. And he invited to the contest all the men who were noted not only for their strength and speed at running, but also for their intellectual accomplishments. That's Sophia again, honouring them with sizable gifts. So you see how the writer of this text, for over years, has interpreted the Hesiod text and expanded it to make it so there were games for, there were competitions for strength and speed, and then there were also competitions for poetry. That's what seemed plausible, a plausible kind of elaboration of those lines in Hesiod. Now, what happens at this competition? First of all, Hesiod presents various questions to Homer. He asks him, what is the best thing for men? Homer says, best not to be born. What is the finest thing for mortals? Homer then quotes a little bit of the Odyssey about the loveliness of the feast. So the first part's a kind of test of his wisdom about mortal life. The next bit is rather curious. Okay, we have these kind of riddles in which Hesiod sets Homer poetic problems. Right? So the first one goes like this. I'll go through one. I'll give you one to try to do. Hesiod says, so they feasted, given this line, he feeds in this line, and then Homer has to deal with it in response. This is like a kind of, I don't know what to call it, like a rap battle, I don't know what to call it. It's like a kind of game for bards to play against each other, because obviously they are supposedly all poets who can think up lines on the spot. This may remind you of an episode from Frogs, if you've read it. So they feasted throughout the day with no food. Homer solves that thing. How can you feast throughout the day with no food? Homer completes it the next night, no food of their own. It was provided by Agamemnon, Lord of Men. He solves the riddle. Okay? Let's see if you can do this next part. You can beat Homer here also. This man's father is brave and a coward. How's Homer going to solve this one? Anyone got an idea? Want to play Homer in this moment? Anyone want to have a go? It's quite hard. So we're not all Homer. This is meant to be Homer proving his genius. And the coward is his mother. So fighting is hard for women. So this is the way that Homer seems to be proving his mettle against Hesiod in this particular poetic contest and athletic competition. After this we have some more questions, and the crowd, they want to vote for Homer, but the Peloponnesians, the king, said we want one last part of the competition. Can you tell me your most beautiful bit of poetry? Hesiod comes up first, he goes straight off the mark, and he gives a little bit more things which he talks about astronomy and some wisdom about how to use the stars to shape your life. When the Pleiades before the planets rise, before the Pleiades is a constellation, rise before the sun, I begin the reaping. The ploughing, I begin when they set. So this is kind of Hesiod imparting wisdom, you think, right? Homer starts out in a passage from Iliad, book 13, about the two Ajaxes standing in battle, at bay, like 2 lines. About the two Ajaxes, the battle line stood strong. It goes on for about 30 or 40 lines. And now, it's very, very exciting. I won't go into here, but it's a very great passage of the Iliad. Now, the response of the crowd to these two is that they prefer Homer. Once again, the Greeks were struck with admiration for Homer, praising the way the verses transcended the merely fitting, and they called upon him to be awarded the victory. The king, however, garlanded Hesiod, saying that it was right for the poet to encourage people towards agriculture and peace to win, not the one who rehearsed battle and carnage. So that is how they say Hesiod got his victory, and that he received a bronze tripod and dedicated it to the Muses. Now, this story is quite fanciful. And you can see how some later writer has basically expanded and filled in the gaps of the Hesiodic poem and made it into this quite fun story about Homer and Hesiod and their different styles of poetry, some kind of caricature. Of course, Hesiod is not only writing about constellations and when to reap and sow, but that is part of his poems. And Homer is not only writing about battles, but that is part of his poetry. This caricature enables two different poetries to be compared, and one poetry to be found preferable. And the reason it's found preferable, according to this king, notice that the king decides differently from the population, from the audience, the rest of the audience, is that it's good for society, that Hesiod's poem is better for society than Homer's. And that might remind us of what Xenophanes said about the problem with athletes who do nothing for society, whereas people like him, with their wisdom, make cities prosperous. The same thing in the Euripides Ortilicus fragment, where he said you should only read people who do good for their communities, with their sophia, with their wisdom. Now, we don't think that... we don't think that the musical contests at the Pythian Games, which someone here wisely knew about, were actually anything like this. But it's worth just comparing them, I think, and seeing how different they are, and seeing if they might cast any light upon each other. So, this is from Pausanias. We know that there were musical contests at the Pythian Games from various sources, but our most detailed sources are, again, late. And the idea is, according to Pausanias, that the Pythian Games don't begin with athletics and then add on music later. They start with music and add athletics later. So the oldest contests, and then for the one for which they first offered prizes, was, according to tradition, the singing of a hymn to the god. This is word hymn again. Remember, Hesiod wins with his hymn. The man who sang and won the first prize was Chrysothemis of Crete, whose father Carmel was said to have cleansed Apollo. Right, so this is the story, it was the foundation of the Pythian Games. The Pytho was a dragon who was killed by Apollo in this situation, and this is a moment when he kills the Pytho, that's what the Pythian Games commemorate. So after he kills him, Carmel cleansed Apollo, and as his son Chrysothemis is the first victor in the musical contest. Now, you might not have heard of these guys, and it's quite interesting. Pausanias immediately goes on to start bringing up some celebrities. So who was singing at these early Pythian contests? They say that Orpheus, a proud man, and conceited about his mysteries. And Musaeus, who copied Orpheus and everything, refused to submit to the competition for musical skill. They didn't want to take part in case they don't win. The story is that Hesiod too was debarred from competing because he had not learned to accompany his own singing on the harp. Homer too came to Delphi to inquire about his needs, but even though he had learned to play the harp, he would have found the skill useless owing to the loss of his eyesight. This is a rather strange and obscure little timeline. It's not really clear why Homer's blindness was often playing harp and often competing. Maybe because the sort of taboo management and disability is unclear. But here we have this idea that these celebrity poets didn't necessarily take part, which I find sort of curious. What we do have is Terpander. Maybe he's a slightly more historical figure, Spartan, right? Even Terpander, he declares, whose forte was the Kitharonic or Lyre Signonic, and to whom he ascribes many of the nomes, these are tunes. In each of them, set his own or Homer's epic lines for music, to music for singing at the games. There was reason to believe that Terpander was supreme in the art of lyre song. It is recorded that he won the prize at the Pythian Games 4 times. Right? So Terpander is a very early, semi-legendary Spartan, I think Spartan, at least Peloponnesian musician, and he's supposed to have won the Pythian Games 4 times. Now note here that this musical contest, these early metrical musical contests, seem to be not just about playing the altos, they are about singing. Right? It's about singing with the altos. It's about singing with, not about playing the altos, but singing with the lyre, I should say. So this is perhaps different from the Pindar vector, the vector celebrating the Pindar poem, whose one is his playing of the aulos. And when they say it's singing at the end, these are obviously very late sources, and this is, I should say, pseudo-Plutarch. It's not even Plutarch, it's someone who's pretending, who's being passed down as Plutarch. The point is that they are singing, basically they're singing epic poems with music. That's what seems to be represented as the earliest kind of musical contest at Pythian Games. Now, what were they actually singing? What was the content of these songs? We don't have any of these songs which survive, especially. No one tells us exactly which song was sung. But we are told this, again, is not a very secure source. So it says that he's read in Aristoctanus that the first flute player to use the lydic mode was Olympus in his lament for the serpent Python. This famous tune by Olympus seems to be a lament for the death of Python with thrones, which is a strange one, because if Python is a dragon, you wouldn't necessarily lament for their death. But it seems that there was this song which was a lament. Now, this is also recorded in Strabo. The thing about Strabo is this story doesn't quite make sense, it doesn't quite blend with it. There went a certain melody called the Pythian Nome. The melody was composed by Demosthenes, admiral of the second Ptolemy, and through this melody he means to celebrate the contest between Apollo and the dragon, setting forth the prelude and the first contest, these different parts of the tune which are meant to represent it. Now, notice this is music rather than song at this point. But there was a continuation of this tradition of singing about the battle of music which commemorates the battle between Apollo and Python. So I'll just have a last thing to explain about the evolution of this tradition. So this is again Pausanias. He's talking about the 3rd year of the 48th Olympiad. It's 586 BC, so really very early. The Epictetus held contests, and they added competitions for flute playing. So this is where the flute playing comes in. Until that moment, it's only lyre playing. On that occasion, they also offered, for the first time, prizes for athletes, and the competitions were being the same as those at Olympia. So the idea is, according to Pausanias, that there were no athletic competitions for the first 100 years of the Pythian Games. They were just musical competitions. And finally, at the next Pythian festival, they no longer offered prizes for events. They also gave a crown for victory. On this occasion, so this is the second Pythian Games after the reform in 586. On this occasion, they no longer included singing to the flute, thinking that the music was ill-omened to listen to, for the tunes of the flute were most dismal, and the words sung to the tunes were lamentations. There we have it again, this reference to a kind of sad song that seemed to be the content of the competition at the Pythian Games. So I don't really have a conclusion here, except to say that in the Pindar poem that I reported at the beginning, Pindar Pythian 12, you recall that there is no mention of Apollo, but rather of Athena. And Athena is said to have invented the song of the Eros out of the laments of the Gorgons. But you can see also that there was a similarity in these two stories. There was a monster who is dispatched, and following that dispatching of the monster, there is a kind of there's a musical tradition of lamenting, of a thread which comes out of that, which is then carried through into the competition for musical performance at the Pythian Games. And this song, I think, is something which we don't really know what it would have sounded like, of course, because we don't have the musical notation. But I think it's interesting to consider that alongside the high-octane athletic contest, there was a competition in a rather ambivalent musical practice of lamenting for the death of either a Gorgon or a dragon. That's as far as I've got in my inquiries into this matter, but I would welcome further inquiries from you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Xavier. We've got a few minutes left before lunch. I might stall you a bit because I'm worried that lunch hasn't turned up yet. We won't know, it's like Schrodinger's cat. We don't know whether it's out there or not until we go out there. So has anyone got any questions for Xavier about music at athletic contests? And while you're thinking, you can start filling out your feedback forms as well.
So I was going to ask, the previous lectures, we were basically talking about how horrible it was to lose. Like it was so awful. Was it similar for competitions like this with poetry and music as it was with athleticism?
Yes. I mean, that's curious. So one of our difficulties is that we're a bit. It's a bit. We don't have so many records of the losers of the musical competitions as we do of the athletic ones. One of the things I find curious about that strange text, the contest of Homer and Hesiod, is that Hesiod's recorded as winning this victory, and then we just carry on talking about Homer and how he lived out the rest of his life sailing around different parts of the Aegean. Doesn't seem to be particularly bothered by having lost out to Hesiod, according to this fictional narrative. And I wonder, I mean, the experience of losing, let's say, a chariot race is an extremely expensive feat. Whereas the experience of not having won your rendition of the Pythian normally is perhaps you can come back next year and try again, you know. But I do, I wonder about losing musical competitions and how people feel. That's an interesting area. I wonder about people who lose. If there are records of how people react to losing the tragic competitions or the comic competitions. Is that very humiliating too? The Greeks do hate to lose. Any other questions? Yeah.
So we talked about the lyre and flutes, but were there any other musical instruments that would be used during the games?
Wow. I mean, that's quite hard. I mean, basically, there's a lot of politics about instruments, right? First of all, there's different kinds of lyres. For different purposes, it's not clear which lyre is also always being depicted. Depends on how many strings, depends how elaborate Francesca is. And there are different names for me, the barbitos, lura. But these are different. These are slightly different stringed instruments. And the allos, it seems to be. I'm interested in. We have, I think, if we go back to the Pythian Odes. I don't know how to explain this, but I did notice that when we talk about about the sound of the pipes, the tune often passes through thin bronze and the reeds, which so this is a bronze pipe. I'm curious about what this bronze might be, this bronze instrument. But maybe my test might go on to that question.
It could be the first part.
The first part of the beginning.
Yes.
I see. That makes more sense.
You could use one, there were multiple types, so there was also the transverse one, like the flute that we have, yes, the metal one. There was also the syrinx, which was a sort of pan flute.
Like a harmonica.
I've seen that. It's like many
Pipes.
Yeah, pipes tied together, and one shorter than the other. That was associated with shepherds, like in the fields that would find the things make the pipes and put them together, and different types.
So there are these different, many definitions, as Francesca says, and I suppose there's there's not time to get into the politics of musical instruments, but there's an idea that the singing to the lyre is what Achilles does from the Iliad, but also it's generally what it's an aristocratic pursuit, whereas the Allos seems always to have these connotations of the irrational, the more democratic sort of decline of Athens, as the aristocrats put it. But you'll see that in that history of the Pythian Games, as they have an idea that the lyre is replaced by the Allos, by the flute. There was a question up there.
Yeah, when it comes to the actual contest, would musical contests have the same kind of glory and prize that would be one of the Olympic Games? Because they were brought in sessions, but with Heslock was just given a tripod. They had the same kind of level of importance.
Well, this is difficult. I mean, it's hard to know exactly where the contest is deriving its sort of sociology from. I mean, the idea of a set of competitions with different prizes is the kind of archaic idea. So you've got the sort of classic idea of the victor coming back to their city and being celebrated for. If the writer of the contest of Homer and Hesiod is imagining sort of Homeric times, you'll see that, for instance, in the games, in the single games in the Iliad, there's always going back to their city to be feted. They're getting given prizes by Achilles. So it's a competition which is a much more aristocratic world in which the judges of the competition are kings, and they give out objects as rewards. The classical idea is that you're given a completely worthless crown, but it's the glory that crown represents and then is concretized when you return to your, is actualized when you actually return to your city. So there are different kinds of prizes available. I don't know what, I mean, in that Pindar poem which I put up there, this one, in fact, the idea is that just like athletic victor, Pindar addresses, this doesn't change the form of his poem. He addresses the home city and says, receive your victor. And what we can only imagine that is that receive him with honour, right? Take him in and honour him in the same way you would an athletic victor. I don't know if we know about the processions or certainly there's enough in these complaints that we don't get feasts for products. And Autolycus is the speaker. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
Would the music contestants recite their own songs, or would they recite famous ones like Hesiod or
This I find hard to answer. I mean, at the Pythian Games, it seems from that, I don't know, our sources are so late, but it seems that it seems to be completely okay to recite other people's songs. It seems that you could recite your own, but always this mythical thing, because Homer and Hesiod are right to participate, we can't participate. But then I think I've actually skipped out a sentence from that text where it says that someone won even though he was singing someone else's song. So you could, it was normal. Yeah, it's a sentence before this one. You could win by singing someone else's songs. At least according to this mythical early history of it. Later on, it seems you're playing a tune. There seems to be a famous tune which is associated with someone actually hums in Aristophanes. I don't know whether people are making up their own songs. I think this is a good question for Francesca. Are people making up their own songs when they're in musical tunes, when they're competing at things?
There were different competitions. There were competitions that were open to new poems and to new songs, and there were also competitions where you would be required was the kithara, from which we get our guitar, and there were some set kitharodic nomoi, they are called, which are set tunes that they have the same. It was the same tune basically. It was traditional, and yeah, the performers would perform. It's like today, I don't know, you have a musical competition, you perform the same piece by Beethoven, and you're assessed on your rendition of that piece. But there were also competitions that were open to other, to new pieces.
And there seems to be a general kind of complaint through classical times that the increasing deregularization of music, which seems to be putting strange songs, strange words into incongruous music and words together, or changing your not halfway through your song, changing your rhythm, changing your speed, changing your melody, which suggests that at least there's an idea of traditional music which is fixed and stable, and wouldn't change, I guess, even if you add new words or whatever, but would be on the same themes.
Yeah, it has also to do with the instrument. Because at the beginning the lyre had 7 chords, the kithara and lyre had 7 chords, but then musicians introduced 2 more, so they had 9, and they could make more, notes, so more melodies, and have a wider extension. But in Sparta, for example, there is a famous tradition that the Spartan legislators didn't like that because it was too much, too new, and so they cut the extra strings from the thunderous lyre to say, no, wait, you're not gonna, or not for Timotheus' lyre, you're not gonna play, this instrument here, too many strings, far too many strings. So yeah, the Greeks, in terms of music, they seem to have been very traditionalist.
Yes. Or at least the writers about music complain about
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
there's all this innovation going on, but we never have anyone defending innovation. I think Timotheus does a bit. He sort of says, I am the inheritor and I made it new.
Yeah, exactly. But the authorities didn't like that. But real life was very different. There were, lots of different musical traditions.
Okay, I think we better call it a day there. So thank you, Xavier and Francesca.